Mm, The frost in the morning of October 28th was thick enough to look like a dusting of snow, a cruel harbinger of the brutal winter that was about to descend on the Bitterroot Valley. Clara Higgins stood on the porch of the farmhouse she had called home for 15 years, her breath pluming in the frigid air. In her trembling hands, she held a court order stamped with the heavy red seal of the county. "I'm sorry, Clara," Sheriff Miller said, looking anywhere but at her face. He shifted his weight, his boots crunching on the frozen wooden boards. The judge ruled in Ethan's favor. The property, the house, the accounts, they all revert to the Collins estate. Behind the sheriff stood Ethan Collins, the half-brother of Clara's late husband, Thomas. Ethan was a man whose soul was as sharply angled and unforgiving as his jawline. Thomas had died just 6 months prior, in a horrific collapse at the deep fine copper mine up north. In the wake of her grief, Clara had been utterly blindsided by Ethan's legal maneuvering. Through a twisted loophole and a highly questionable codicil that Ethan claimed to have found in their late father's desk, he had successfully argued that Thomas never had the right to deed the farmhouse to Clara. "You have until noon to clear your personal effects, Clara," Ethan said, his voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "I have a buyer arriving from Missoula tomorrow. I can't have a squatter complicating the sale." Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. The tears had all been spent mourning Thomas. She simply turned around, walked into the home she had meticulously built, and packed a single canvas rucksack and a small wooden handcart. She took heavy wool blankets, her cast-iron Dutch oven, a hunting knife, a hatchet, a lantern, matches, 2 sacks of flour, dried beans, and her husband's heavy canvas winter coat. By 11:30 a.m., she was walking down the dirt driveway, leaning into the biting wind. She was 42 years old, entirely alone and practically penniless. The townspeople of nearby Oak Haven turned their heads as she passed. Some felt pity, but none offered a spare room. Ethan Collins owned the bank, the general store, and half the mortgages in town. Crossing him was financial suicide. Clara walked past the town limits, heading toward the rugged, unforgiving slopes of Blackwood Ridge. She had a destination in mind, a desperate, wild plan born of a memory she shared with Thomas. Years ago, while exploring the backcountry, Thomas, a man who understood the earth better than he understood people, had taken her off the main trails to a massive limestone escarpment. Hidden behind a dense thicket of old-growth pine was a deep, cavernous overhang. The locals whispered about Bear Mouth Cave, avoiding it due to superstitions and its sheer remoteness. But Thomas had loved it. "If the world ever goes to hell, Clara," Thomas had joked, his eyes crinkling with a smile she still saw in her dreams, "we'll move in here. The rock is solid. The earth is ancient." It took Clara 2 grueling days to reach the escarpment. The trail was mostly vertical, forcing her to drag the handcart over roots and jagged rocks. When she finally pushed through the dense pines, the massive maw of the cave loomed before her, shadowed and silent. It was at least 30 feet wide and went back into the mountain further than the fading daylight could illuminate. The temperature dropped drastically as November arrived. The sky turned a bruised, permanent gray. Clara knew that without a proper shelter, the Montana winter would kill her within a week. The cave provided a roof, but it was a wind tunnel. She needed to build a wall. For the next 3 weeks, Clara worked with a feverish, desperate energy. She became a creature of mud and stone. Using the handcart, she hauled loose limestone rocks from the surrounding hillsides. She mixed the heavy, clay-rich earth near a frozen creek with pine needles and dried grass to create a thick, rudimentary mortar. She began dry stacking the stones across the mouth of the cave, leaving only a narrow gap for a door and a small hole near the top for a chimney. Her hands bled, her fingernails cracked and broke. Every muscle in her back screamed in agony as she lifted stones that weighed 40, 50, sometimes 60 pounds. When her strength failed, she used thick oak branches as levers to roll the boulders into place. Slowly, incredibly, a stone cabin began to take shape within the mouth of the cave. The rock wall sealed off the elements, transforming the shallow cavern into an enclosed room of roughly 20 by 20 feet. For a door, she lashed together thick pine boughs and an old canvas tarp she found buried at the bottom of her cart. But a terrifying reality was looming. Firewood. Clara spent her days chopping deadfall, dragging timber back to her stone sanctuary. But as the first flakes of snow began to fall in late November, she stared at her woodpile in despair. It was barely a cord of wood. To survive a high-altitude winter, constantly feeding a fire to keep from freezing to death in a stone tomb, she needed at least 5 cords. She had scavenged the immediate area clean of deadwood, and she didn't have the physical strength or the right tools to fell massive wet trees and season them. I am going to freeze to death, Clara thought, sitting on a flat stone, watching the first blizzard of the year swallow the forest. Ethan won. He threw me to the wolves and the winter will finish the job. The blizzard struck on December 3rd. It was a howling, blinding whiteout that dropped 3 feet of snow in a single night. The temperature plummeted to 15 below zero. Inside her stone cabin, Clara huddled in her heavy coat, wrapped in 3 wool blankets, feeding precious logs into her small fire pit. The smoke drafted out of the hole in her rock wall, but the heat was entirely insufficient to warm the massive, cold stone of the cave around her. By the second night of the storm, she was shivering violently, the onset of hypothermia muddling her thoughts. She had used the bathroom, but stepping outside was a death sentence. Taking her lantern, she decided to venture deeper into the dark recesses of the cave, beyond the area she had claimed as her living space. The cavern narrowed about 50 feet back, sloping sharply downward. Clara navigated the damp, jagged floor, her lantern casting long, eerie shadows. Then she noticed something strange. She wasn't shivering anymore. Clara stopped, blinking through the dim light. She held up her bare hand. The air here wasn't biting. It was warm. She took another 10 steps down the narrow throat of the cave. A distinct smell hit her, earthy, slightly sulfurous, like struck matches and wet stone. The temperature continued to rise. By the time she reached a dead end, roughly 100 feet into the mountain, she was actually sweating. She lowered her lantern. At the base of the rock wall, a pool of black water bubbled gently. Steam rose from its surface, thick and heavy, coating the cave walls in a warm layer of condensation. Clara fell to her knees, staring at the subterranean hot spring. Thomas, a miner who knew geology, had brought her here years ago, but they had never explored the very back of the cave. He probably hadn't even known this geothermal vent was here. The heated water was warming the surrounding limestone from the inside out. The rock itself was a massive thermal battery. A wild, breathless laugh escaped Clara's cracked lips. She pressed her palms flat against the cave wall. It was radiating heat like a massive, gentle stove. She didn't need the fire to survive. The mountain was alive, and its blood was boiling hot. Clara immediately dragged her blankets, her provisions, and her makeshift bed deeper into the cave, setting up her camp just 20 feet from the thermal pool, far enough to avoid the dampness, but close enough to bask in the ambient temperature, which hovered at a miraculous 65 degrees. The rest of the winter was an exercise in solitude, reflection, and quiet triumph. Outside, the world was an icy hellscape. Avalanches roared down Blackwood Ridge. The snow piled up against her stone wall, burying the entrance entirely. But inside, Clara lived in a strange subterranean paradise. She used her meager wood pile exclusively for cooking her beans and baking flatbread over a tiny, carefully managed flame, because she didn't need the fire for warmth. A single log could last her days just for boiling water and cooking. Her firewood lasted the entire winter. In fact, by the time March rolled around, she still had a quarter of her original pile left. During those long months underground, Clara had time to think. She thought about Ethan. She thought about Thomas. She dug through the old canvas rucksack, going through the few papers she had managed to snatch from Thomas's desk before the sheriff arrived. One night, by the light of her lantern, she unfolded a heavy yellow document she had found tucked inside an old leather diary of Thomas's. It was a deed of sale. Clara's eyes widened as she read the coordinates and the legal jargon. Thomas hadn't just discovered Bearmouth Cave. He had legally purchased the 100-acre parcel surrounding it 5 years ago from the county, using his private mining wages. But he hadn't put it in his name. Knowing how litigious and greedy his half-brother Ethan was, Thomas had put the deed solely in the name of Clary Higgins. It was separate from the estate. Ethan had absolutely no claim to this mountain. Spring finally broke the icy grip of the valley in late April. The snowmelt turned the rivers into raging torrents. Down in Oak Haven, Ethan Collins sat in his warm office drinking imported whiskey. He had sold Thomas and Clara's farmhouse for a fortune to a wealthy cattle baron. He assumed Clary Higgins was long dead, her bones picked clean by coyotes somewhere in the foothills. "Sheriff," Ethan said, adjusting his vest as Miller walked into the bank, "the snow has cleared up to the ridge. I want you to take a ride up the trail. If you find my sister-in-law's remains, bag them up so we can give her a proper, decent burial. I don't want the town thinking I'm entirely heartless." Sheriff Miller, harboring immense guilt over his role in the eviction, rode out the next morning. It took him half the day to navigate the muddy, debris-strewn trails up to the limestone escarpment. He expected to find a frozen corpse huddled beneath a tree. Instead, as he pushed through the pines, he stopped his horse, staring in absolute disbelief. Built into the massive mouth of the cave was a brilliant, sturdy stone wall. A makeshift chimney puffed a thin ribbon of fragrant pine smoke into the crisp spring air. Outside the structure, a woman was kneeling in the dirt, planting wild onions and turning the soil with a trowel. Clara looked up. She was leaner, her face tanned from the spring sun, her eyes bright and piercing. She looked tougher than the mountain itself. "Morning, Sheriff," Clara called out, her voice clear and strong. "Clara," Miller gasped, sliding off his horse. "My God, we thought you were dead. How did you survive? You had no wood, no shelter." "I built one," she said simply, gesturing to the heavy stone facade. "And the earth provided the rest." News of Clara's survival spread through Oak Haven like a wildfire. When Ethan Collins heard it, his face turned the color of spoiled milk. Enraged that she had outlived his cruelty, he immediately rode up the mountain with the town's circuit judge, Judge Silas Croft, and Sheriff Miller in tow. Ethan stormed up to the stone wall, where Clara was calmly drinking tea from a tin cup. "You can't be here, Clara," Ethan barked, his horse stomping the ground. "This is unzoned county land. You're squatting again." "Sheriff, arrest her for trespassing." Clara didn't flinch. She set her cup down, reached inside her coat, and pulled out the yellowed document. She walked forward and handed it up to Judge Croft, bypassing Ethan entirely. "Judge," Clara said, her voice echoing slightly against the rock wall, "could you please read the name on that deed and the coordinates of the parcel?" Judge Croft adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the thick paper. He looked from the paper to the surrounding cliffs, then down to Ethan. "Well, Ethan," the judge said slowly, a hint of amusement dancing in his voice, "it appears you are the one trespassing. This 100-acre tract, including the limestone escarpment and the cave, is legally owned by Clara Higgins, purchased free and clear 5 years ago." Ethan's jaw dropped. "That's impossible. Thomas's estate had nothing to do with this," Clara interrupted, stepping toward him, her gaze hard as flint. "He bought it for me. He knew exactly what kind of snake you were, Ethan. Now, get off my property." Ethan tried to argue, threatening to take it to the state Supreme Court, but Judge Croft simply shook his head. "The deed is ironclad, Ethan, and I suggest you leave before Mrs. Higgins decides to press charges for trespassing." Humiliated, Ethan turned his horse and rode back down the mountain. But the twists of fate were not finished. The following year, a geological survey team, hearing rumors of Clara's hot spring, approached her. The geothermal vent in her cave wasn't just a small puddle, it was part of a massive, untapped subterranean thermal system. Clara sold the drilling rights to a clean energy company. For a sum that eclipsed Ethan Collins's entire net worth, she didn't move away. Instead, she used the money to hire proper masons to expand her stone cabin, turning the cave into a sprawling, beautiful subterranean home with glass windows, a proper roof over the stone facade, and heated floors powered naturally by the earth. Ethan Collins, however, met a different fate. In his arrogance and greed, he over-leveraged his bank investments to cover massive gambling debts in Chicago. When the market dipped, his empire crumbled. He lost the bank, the properties, and eventually his freedom, serving 5 years in the state penitentiary for embezzlement. Clara Higgins lived to be 89 years old. She became a legend in the Bitterroot Valley, the widow, who was thrown to the wolves and returned leading the pack. Every winter, as the blizzards raged and the snow buried the world in ice, Clara sat in her beautiful stone home inside the earth, drinking hot tea, warm and safe, forever protected by the secret fire of the mountain.